Bertrand Arthur William Russell, 3rd Earl Russell, the 18th of May, 1872. The 2nd of February, 1970, was a British philosopher, logician, mathematician, and public intellectual. He had influence on mathematics, logic, set theory, and various areas of analytic philosophy. He was one of the early 20th century's prominent logicians and a founder of analytic philosophy, along with his predecessor Gottlob Frege, his friend and colleague G.E. Moore, and his student and protege Ludwig Wittgenstein. Russell with Moore led the British revolt against idealism. Together with his former teacher and Whitehead, Russell wrote Principia Mathematica, a milestone in the development of classical logic and a major attempt to reduce the whole of mathematics to logic. Russell's article on denoting has been considered a paradigm of philosophy. Russell was a pacifist who championed anti-imperialism and chaired the India League. He went to prison for his pacifism during World War I and initially supported appeasement against Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany before changing his view in 1943, describing war as a necessary lesser of two evils. In the wake of World War II, he welcomed American global hegemony in preference to either Soviet hegemony or no or ineffective world leadership, even if it were to come at the cost of using their nuclear weapons. He would later criticize Stalinist totalitarianism, condemn the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, and become an outspoken proponent of nuclear disarmament. In 1950, Russell was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in recognition of his varied and significant writings in which he champions humanitarian ideals and freedom of thought. He was also the recipient of the De Morgan Medal, 1932, Sylvester Medal, 1934, Kalinga Prize, 1957, and Jerusalem Prize, 1963. Russell was born at Ravenscroft, a country house in Trellick, Monmouthshire, on the 18th of May, 1872, into an influential and liberal family of the British aristocracy. His parents were Viscount and Viscountess Amberley. Lord Amberley consented to his wife's affair with their children's tutor, the biologist Douglas Spalding. Both were early advocates of birth control at a time when this was considered scandalous. Lord Amberley was a deist, and even asked the philosopher John Stuart Mill to act as Russell's secular godfather. Mill died the year after Russell's birth, but his writings later influenced Russell's life. Russell had two siblings, brother Frank, 7 years older, and sister Rachel, 4 years older. In June 1874, Russell's mother died of diphtheria, followed shortly by Rachel's death. In January 1876, his father died of bronchitis after a long period of depression. Frank and Bertrand were placed in the care of Victorian paternal grandparents, who lived at Pembroke Lodge in Richmond Park. His grandfather, former Prime Minister Earl Russell, died in 1878 and was remembered by Russell as a kind old man in a wheelchair. His grandmother, the Countess Russell, was the central family figure for the rest of Russell's childhood and youth. The Countess was from a Scottish Presbyterian family and petitioned the Court of Chancery to set aside a provision in Amberley's will requiring the children to be raised as agnostics. Despite her religious conservatism, she held progressive views in other areas, accepting Darwinism and supporting Irish Home Rule, and her influence on Bertrand Russell's outlook on social justice and standing up for principle remained with him throughout his life. Her favorite Bible verse, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil," became his motto. The atmosphere at Pembroke Lodge was one of frequent prayer, emotional repression, and formality. Frank reacted to this with open rebellion, but the young Bertrand learned to hide his feelings. Russell's adolescence was lonely and he contemplated suicide. He remarked in his autobiography that his interest in nature and books and later mathematics saved me from complete despondency. Only his wish to know more mathematics kept him from suicide. He was educated at home by a series of tutors. When Russell was 11 years old, his brother Frank introduced him to the work of Euclid, which he described in his autobiography as one of the great events of my life, as dazzling as first love. During these formative years, he also discovered the works of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Russell wrote, "I spent all my spare time reading him and learning him by heart, knowing no one to whom I could speak of what I thought or felt. I used to reflect how wonderful it would have been to know Shelley and to wonder whether I should meet any live human being with whom I should feel so much sympathy." Russell claimed that beginning at age 15, he spent considerable time thinking about the validity of Christian religious dogma, which he found unconvincing. At this age, he came to the conclusion that there is no free will, and 2 years later, that there is no life after death. Finally, at the age of 18, after reading Mill's autobiography, he abandoned the first cause argument and became an atheist. He traveled to the continent in 1890 with an American friend, Edward Fitzgerald, and with Fitzgerald's family he visited the Paris exhibition of 1889 and climbed the Eiffel Tower soon after it was completed. Russell won a scholarship to read for the mathematical tripos at Trinity College, Cambridge, and began his studies there in 1890, taking as coach Robert Rumsey Webb. He became acquainted with the younger George Edward Moore and came under the influence of Alfred North Whitehead, who recommended him to the Cambridge Apostles. He distinguished himself in mathematics and philosophy, graduating as 7th Wrangler in the former in 1893 and becoming a fellow in the latter in 1895. Russell began his published work in 1896 with German Social Democracy, a study in politics that was an early indication of his interest in political and social theory. In 1896, he taught German social democracy at the London School of Economics. He was a member of the Coefficients Dining Club of social reformers set up in 1902 by the Fabian campaigners Sidney and Beatrice Webb. He now started a study of the foundations of mathematics at Trinity. In 1897, he wrote an essay on the foundations of geometry which discussed the Cayley-Klein metrics used for non-Euclidean geometry. He attended the first International Congress of Philosophy in Paris in 1900, where he met Giuseppe Peano and Alessandro Padua. The Italians had responded to Georg Cantor, making a science of set theory. They gave Russell their literature, including the Formulario Matematico. Russell was impressed by the precision of Peano's arguments at the Congress, read the literature upon returning to England, and came upon Russell's paradox. In 1903, he published The Principles of Mathematics, a work on the foundations of mathematics. It advanced a thesis of logicism, that mathematics and logic are one and the same. At the age of 29, in February 1901, Russell underwent what he called a sort of mystic illumination, after witnessing Whitehead's wife suffering in an angina attack. I found myself filled with semi-mystical feelings about beauty and with a desire almost as profound as that of the Buddha to find some philosophy which should make human life endurable, Russell would later recall. At the end of those 5 minutes, I had become a completely different person. In 1905, he wrote the essay on denoting, which was published in the philosophical journal Mind. Russell was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, FRS, in 1908. The 3-volume Principia Mathematica, written with Whitehead, was published between 1910 and 1913. This, along with the earlier, The Principles of Mathematics, soon made Russell world famous in his field. Russell's first political activity was as the independent Liberal candidate in the 1907 by-election for the Wimbledon constituency, where he was not elected. In 1910, he became a lecturer at the University of Cambridge, Trinity College, where he had studied. He was considered for a fellowship, which would give him a vote in the college government and protect him from being fired for his opinions, but was passed over because he was anti-clerical, because he was agnostic. He was approached by the Austrian engineering student Ludwig Wittgenstein, who started undergraduate study with him. Russell viewed Wittgenstein as a successor who would continue his work on logic. He spent hours dealing with Wittgenstein's various phobias and his bouts of despair. This was a drain on Russell's energy, but Russell continued to be fascinated by him and encouraged his academic development, including the publication of Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus in 1922. Russell delivered his lectures on logical atomism, his version of these ideas, in 1918 before the end of World War I. Wittgenstein was at that time serving in the Austrian army and subsequently spent 9 months in an Italian prisoner of war camp at the end of the conflict. During World War I, Russell was one of the few people to engage in active pacifist activities. In 1916, due to his absence of allegiance to the war effort, he was dismissed from Trinity College following his conviction under the Defense of the Realm Act, 1914. He later described this in Free Thought and Official Propaganda as an illegitimate means the state used to violate freedom of expression. Russell championed the case of Eric Chapelleau, a poet jailed and abused as a conscientious objector. Russell played a part in the Leeds Convention in June 1917, a historic event which saw well over 1,000 anti-war socialists gather, many being delegates from the Independent Labour Party and the Socialist Party, united in their pacifist beliefs and advocating a peace settlement. The international press reported that Russell appeared with a number of Labour members of Parliament, including Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden, as well as former Liberal and anti-conscription campaigner Professor Arnold Lupton. After the event, Russell told Lady Ottoline Morell that To my surprise, when I got up to speak, I was given the greatest ovation that was possible to give anybody. His conviction in 1916 resulted in Russell being fined £100, equivalent to £7,100 in 2023, which he refused to pay in the hope that he would be sent to prison, but his books were sold at auction to raise the money. The books were bought by friends. He later treasured his copy of the King James Bible that was stamped confiscated by Cambridge police. A later conviction for publicly lecturing against inviting the United States to enter the war on the United Kingdom's side resulted in 6 months' imprisonment in Brixton Prison in 1918. He was prosecuted under the Defence of the Realm Act. He later said of his imprisonment, "I found prison in many ways quite agreeable. I had no engagements, no difficult decisions to make, no fear of callers, no interruptions to my work. I read enormously. I wrote a book, Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, and began the work for The Analysis of Mind. I was rather interested in my fellow prisoners who seemed to me in no way morally inferior to the rest of the population, though they were on the whole slightly below the usual level of intelligence, as was shown by their having been caught." While he was reading Strachey's eminent Victorian's chapter about Gordon, he laughed out loud in his cell, prompting the warder to intervene and reminding him that prison was a place of punishment. Russell was reinstated to Trinity in 1919, resigned in 1920, was Tarner Lecturer in 1926, and became a Fellow again in 1944 until 1949. In 1924, Russell again gained press attention when attending a banquet in the House of Commons with well-known campaigners, including Arnold Lupton, who had been an MP and had also endured imprisonment for passive resistance to military or naval service. While he was reading Strachey's eminent Victorian's chapter about Gordon, he laughed out loud in his cell, prompting the warder to intervene and reminding him that prison was a place of punishment. Russell was reinstated to Trinity in 1919, resigned in 1920, was Tarner Lecturer in 1926, and became a Fellow again in 1944 until 1949. In 1924, Russell again gained press attention when attending a banquet in the House of Commons with well-known campaigners, including Arnold Lupton, who had been an MP and had also endured imprisonment for passive resistance to military or naval service. In 1941, G.H. Hardy wrote a 61-page pamphlet titled Bertrand Russell and Trinity, in which he gave an authoritative account of Russell's 1916 dismissal from Trinity College, explaining that a reconciliation between the college and Russell had later taken place, and gave details about Russell's personal life. Hardy writes that Russell's dismissal had created a scandal since the vast majority of the fellows of the college opposed the decision. The ensuing pressure from the fellows induced the council to reinstate Russell. In January 1920, it was announced that Russell had accepted the reinstatement offer from Trinity and would begin lecturing in October. In July 1920, Russell applied for a 1-year leave of absence. This was approved. He spent the year giving lectures in China and Japan. In January 1921, it was announced by Trinity that Russell had resigned and his resignation had been accepted. This resignation, Hardy explains, was voluntary and was not the result of another altercation. The reason for the resignation, according to Hardy, was that Russell was going through a tumultuous time in his personal life with a divorce and subsequent remarriage. Russell contemplated asking Trinity for another 1-year leave of absence, but decided against it, since this would have been an unusual application, and the situation had the potential to snowball into another controversy. Although Russell did the right thing, in Hardy's opinion, the reputation of the college suffered with Russell's resignation, since the world of learning knew about Russell's altercation with Trinity, but not that the rift had healed. In 1925, Russell was asked by the Council of Trinity College to give the Tarner Lectures on the philosophy of the sciences. These would later be the basis for one of Russell's best-received books, according to Hardy, The Analysis of Matter, published in 1927. In the preface to the Trinity pamphlet, Hardy wrote, "I wish to make it plain that Russell himself is not responsible, directly or indirectly, for the writing of the pamphlet. I wrote it without his knowledge, and when I sent him the typescript and asked for his permission to print it, I suggested that unless it contained misstatement of fact, he should make no comment on it. He agreed to this. No word has been changed as the result of any suggestion from him." In August 1920, Russell traveled to Soviet Russia as part of an official delegation sent by the British government to investigate the effects of the Russian Revolution. He wrote a 4-part series of articles titled Soviet Russia 1920 for the magazine The Nation. He met Vladimir Lenin and had an hour-long conversation with him. In his autobiography, he mentions that he found Lenin disappointing, sensing an impish cruelty in him and comparing him to an opinionated professor. He cruised down the Volga on a steamship. His experiences destroyed his previous tentative support for the revolution. He subsequently wrote a book, The Practice and Theory of Bolshevism, about his experiences on this trip, taken with a group of 24 others from the UK, all of whom came home thinking well of the Soviet regime, despite Russell's attempts to change their minds. For example, he told them that he had heard shots fired in the middle of the night and was sure that these were clandestine executions, but the others maintained that it was only cars backfiring. Russell's lover, Dora Black, a British author, feminist and socialist campaigner, visited Soviet Russia independently at the same time. In contrast to his reaction, she was enthusiastic about the Bolshevik Revolution. The following year, Russell, accompanied by Dora, visited Peking to lecture on philosophy for a year. He went with optimism and hope, seeing China as then being on a new path. Other scholars present in China at the time included John Dewey and Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian Nobel laureate poet. Before leaving China, Russell became gravely ill with pneumonia, and incorrect reports of his death were published in the Japanese press. When the couple visited Japan on their return journey, Dora took on the role of spurning the local press by handing out notices reading, "Mr. Bertrand Russell, having died according to the Japanese press, is unable to give interviews to Japanese journalists." Apparently, they found this harsh and reacted resentfully. Russell supported his family during this time by writing popular books explaining matters of physics, ethics, and education to the layman. From 1922 to 1927, the Russells divided their time between London and Cornwall, spending summers in Porthcurno. In the 1922 and 1923 general elections, Russell stood as a Labour Party candidate in the Chelsea constituency, but only on the basis that he knew he was unlikely to be elected in such a safe Conservative seat, and he was unsuccessful on both occasions. After the birth of his two children, he became interested in education, especially early childhood education. He was not satisfied with the old traditional education and thought that progressive education also had some flaws. As a result, together with Dora, Russell founded the experimental Beacon Hill School in 1927. The school was run from a succession of different locations, including its original premises at the Russells' residence, Telegraph House near Harting, West Sussex. During this time, he published on education, especially in early childhood. On the 8th of July 1930, Dora gave birth to her third child, Harriet Ruth. After he left the school in 1932, Dora continued it until 1943. In 1927, Russell met Barry Fox, later Barry Stevens, who became a known Gestalt therapist and writer in later years. They developed an intense relationship, and in Fox's words, "For 3 years we were very close." Fox sent her daughter Judith to Beacon Hill School. From 1927 to 1932, Russell wrote 34 letters to Fox. Upon the death of his elder brother Frank in 1931, Russell became the third Earl Russell. His marriage to Dora grew tenuous, and it reached a breaking point over her having 2 children with an American journalist, Griffin Barry. They separated in 1932 and finally divorced. On the 18th of January 1936, Russell married his third wife, an Oxford undergraduate named Patricia Peter Spence, who had been his children's governess since 1930. Russell and Peter had one son, Conrad Sebastian Robert Russell, 5th Earl Russell, who became a historian and one of the leading figures in the Liberal Democrat Party. Russell returned in 1937 to the London School of Economics to lecture on the science of power. During the 1930s, Russell became a friend and collaborator of V.K. Krishna Menon, then president of the India League, the foremost lobby in the United Kingdom for Indian independence. Russell chaired the India League from 1932 to 1939. Russell's political views changed over time, mostly about war. He opposed rearmament against Nazi Germany. In 1937, he wrote in a personal letter, "If the Germans succeed in sending an invading army to England, we should do best to treat them as visitors, give them quarters, and invite the commander-in-chief to dine with the Prime Minister." In 1940, he changed his appeasement view that avoiding a full-scale world war was more important than defeating Hitler. He concluded that Adolf Hitler taking over all of Europe would be a permanent threat to democracy. In 1943, he adopted a stance toward large-scale warfare called relative political pacifism. War was always a great evil, but in some particularly extreme circumstances it may be the lesser of two evils. Before World War II, Russell taught at the University of Chicago, later moving on to Los Angeles to lecture at the UCLA Department of Philosophy. He was appointed professor at the City College of New York, CCNY, in 1940, but after a public outcry, the appointment was annulled by a court judgment that pronounced him morally unfit to teach at the college because of his opinions, especially those relating to sexual morality, detailed in Marriage and Morals, 1929. The matter was taken to the New York Supreme Court by Jean Kay, who was afraid that her daughter would be harmed by the appointment, though her daughter was not a student at CCNY. Many intellectuals, led by John Dewey, protested at his treatment. Albert Einstein's oft-quoted aphorism that great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds originated in his open letter dated the 19th of March 1940 to Morris Raphael Cohen, a professor emeritus at CCNY, supporting Russell's appointment. Dewey and Horace M. Callan edited a collection of articles on the CCNY affair in the Bertrand Russell case. Russell soon joined the Barnes Foundation, lecturing to a varied audience on the history of philosophy. These lectures formed the basis of a history of Western philosophy. His relationship with the eccentric Albert C. Barnes soon soured, and he returned to the UK in 1944 to rejoin the faculty of Trinity College. Russell participated in many broadcasts over the BBC, particularly the Brains Trust and for the Third programme, on various topical and philosophical subjects. By this time, Russell was known outside academic circles, frequently the subject or author of magazine and newspaper articles, and was called upon to offer opinions on a variety of subjects, even mundane ones. En route to one of his lectures in Trondheim, Russell was one of 24 survivors, out of 43 passengers, of an aeroplane crash in Hommelvik in October 1948. He said he owed his life to smoking, since the people who drowned were in the non-smoking part of the plane. A History of Western Philosophy, 1945, became a bestseller and provided Russell with a steady income for the remainder of his life. In 1942, Russell argued in favor of a moderate socialism capable of overcoming its metaphysical principles. In an inquiry on dialectical materialism, launched by the Austrian artist and philosopher Wolfgang Paalen in his journal Din, Russell said, "I think the metaphysics of both Hegel and Marx plain nonsense. Marx's claim to be science is no more justified than Mary Baker Eddy's. This does not mean that I am opposed to socialism." In 1943, Russell expressed support for Zionism. "I have come gradually to see that in a dangerous and largely hostile world, it is essential to Jews to have some country which is theirs, some region where they are not suspected aliens, some state which embodies what is distinctive in their culture." In a speech in 1948, Russell said that if the USSR's aggression continued, it would be morally worse to go to war after the USSR possessed an atomic bomb than before it possessed one, because if the USSR had no bomb, the West's victory would come more swiftly and with fewer casualties than if there were atomic bombs on both sides. At that time, only the United States possessed an atomic bomb, and the USSR was pursuing an aggressive policy towards the countries in Eastern Europe, which were being absorbed into the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. Many understood Russell's comments to mean that Russell approved of a first strike in a war with the USSR, including Nigel Lawson, who was present when Russell spoke of such matters. Others, including Griffin, who obtained a transcript of the speech, have argued that he was explaining the usefulness of America's atomic arsenal in deterring the USSR from continuing its domination of Eastern Europe. Just after the atomic bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Russell wrote letters and published articles in newspapers from 1945 to 1948, stating clearly that it was morally justified and better to go to war against the USSR using atomic bombs while the United States possessed them and before the USSR did. In September 1949, 1 week after the USSR tested its first A-bomb, but before this became known, Russell wrote that the USSR would be unable to develop nuclear weapons because following Stalin's purges, only science based on Marxist principles would be practiced in the Soviet Union. After it became known that the USSR had carried out its nuclear bomb tests, Russell declared his position advocating the total abolition of atomic weapons. In 1948, Russell was invited by the BBC to deliver the inaugural Reith Lectures, what was to become an annual series of lectures still broadcast by the BBC. His series of 6 broadcasts, titled Authority and the Individual, explored themes such as the role of individual initiative in the development of a community and the role of state control in a progressive society. Russell continued to write about philosophy. He wrote a foreword to Words and Things by Ernest Gellner, which was highly critical of the later thought of Ludwig Wittgenstein and of ordinary language philosophy. Gilbert Ryle refused to have the book reviewed in the philosophical journal Mind, which caused Russell to respond via the Times. The result was a month-long correspondence in the Times between the supporters and detractors of ordinary language philosophy, which was ended when the paper published an editorial critical of both sides, but agreeing with the opponents of ordinary language philosophy. In the King's Birthday Honours of the 9th of June, 1949, Russell was awarded the Order of Merit, and the following year he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. When he was given the Order of Merit, George VI was affable but embarrassed at decorating a former jailbird, saying, "You have sometimes behaved in a manner that would not do if generally adopted." Russell merely smiled, but afterwards claimed that the reply, "That's right, just like your brother," immediately came to mind. In 1950, Russell attended the inaugural conference for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a CIA-funded anti-communist organization committed to the deployment of culture as a weapon during the Cold War. Russell was one of the known patrons of the Congress until he resigned in 1956. In 1952, Russell was divorced by Spence, with whom he had been very unhappy. Conrad, Russell's son by Spence, did not see his father between the time of the divorce and 1968. Russell married his fourth wife, Edith Finch, soon after the divorce on the 15th of December 1952. They had known each other since 1925, and Edith had taught English at Bryn Mawr College near Philadelphia, sharing a house for 20 years with Russell's old friend Lucy Donnelly. Edith remained with him until his death, and by all accounts, their marriage was a happy, close, and loving one. Russell's eldest son John suffered from mental illness, which was the source of ongoing disputes between Russell and his former wife Dora. In 1962, Russell played a public role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In an exchange of telegrams with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, Khrushchev assured him that the Soviet government would not be reckless. Russell sent this telegram to President Kennedy. "Your action desperate, threat to human survival, no conceivable justification. Civilized man condemns it. We will not have mass murder. Ultimatum means war. End this madness." According to historian Peter Knight, after JFK's assassination, Russell, prompted by the emerging work of the lawyer Mark Lane in the US, rallied support from other noteworthy and left-leaning compatriots to form a Who Killed Kennedy committee in June 1964, members of which included Michael Foot, MP, Caroline Benn, the publisher Victor Gollancz, the writers John Arden and J.B. Priestley, and the Oxford history professor Hugh Trevor Roper. Russell published a highly critical article in the Minority of 1 week before the Warren Commission report was published, setting forth 16 questions on the assassination. Russell equated the Oswald case with the Dreyfus affair of late 19th century France, in which the state convicted an innocent man. Russell also criticized the American press for failing to heed any voices critical of the official version. Bertrand Russell was opposed to war from a young age. His opposition to World War I was used as grounds for his dismissal from Trinity College at Cambridge. This incident fused two of his controversial causes, as he had failed to be granted fellow status which would have protected him from firing, because he was not willing to either pretend to be a devout Christian or at least avoid admitting he was agnostic. He later described the resolution of these issues as essential to freedom of thought and expression, citing the incident in Free Thought and Official Propaganda, where he explained that the expression of any idea, even the most obviously bad, must be protected not only from direct state intervention, but also economic leveraging and other means of being silenced. The opinions which are still persecuted strike the majority as so monstrous and immoral that the general principle of toleration cannot be held to apply to them. But this is exactly the same view as that which made possible the tortures of the Inquisition. Russell spent the 1950s and 1960s engaged in political causes primarily related to nuclear disarmament and opposing the Vietnam War. The 1955 Russell-Einstein Manifesto was a document calling for nuclear disarmament and was signed by 11 of the most prominent nuclear physicists and intellectuals of the time. In October 1960. The Committee of 100 Inches was formed with a declaration by Russell and Michael Scott entitled Act or Perish, which called for a movement of non-violent resistance to nuclear war and weapons of mass destruction. In September 1961, at the age of 89, Russell was jailed for 7 days in Brixton Prison for a breach of the peace after taking part in an anti-nuclear demonstration in London. The magistrate offered to exempt him from jail if he pledged himself to good behavior, to which Russell replied, "No, I won't." Russell argued that war between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed inevitable, so it would be a humanitarian gesture to get it over with quickly and have the United States in the dominant position. Currently, Russell argued humanity could survive such a war, whereas a full nuclear war after both sides had manufactured large stockpiles of more destructive weapons was likely to result in the extinction of the human race. Russell later relented from this stance, instead arguing for mutual disarmament by the nuclear powers. In 1956, before and during the Suez Crisis, Russell expressed his opposition to European imperialism in the Middle East. He viewed the crisis as another reminder of the pressing need for an effective mechanism for international governance and to restrict national sovereignty in places such as the Suez Canal area, where general interest is involved. At the same time the Suez Crisis was taking place, the world was also captivated by the Hungarian Revolution and the subsequent crushing of the revolt by intervening Soviet forces. Russell attracted criticism for speaking out fervently against the Suez War while ignoring Soviet repression in Hungary, to which he responded that he did not criticize the Soviets because there was no need. Most of the so-called Western world was fulminating. Although he later feigned a lack of concern, at the time he was disgusted by the brutal Soviet response, and on the 16th of November 1956, he expressed approval for a declaration of support for Hungarian scholars which Michael Polanyi had cabled to the Soviet embassy in London 12 days previously, shortly after Soviet troops had entered Budapest. In November 1957, Russell wrote an article addressing US President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, urging a summit to consider the conditions of coexistence. Khrushchev responded that peace could be served by such a meeting. In January 1958, Russell elaborated his views in The Observer, proposing a cessation of all nuclear weapons production, with the UK taking the first step by unilaterally suspending its own nuclear weapons program, if necessary, and with Germany freed from all alien armed forces and pledged to neutrality in any conflict between East and West. US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles replied for Eisenhower. The exchange of letters was published as the Vital Letters of Russell, Khrushchev, and Dulles. Russell was asked by The New Republic, a liberal American magazine, to elaborate his views on world peace. He urged that all nuclear weapons testing and flights by planes armed with nuclear weapons be halted immediately, and negotiations be opened for the destruction of all hydrogen bombs, with the number of conventional nuclear devices limited to ensure a balance of power. He proposed that Germany be reunified and accept the Oder-Neisse line as its border, and that a neutral zone be established in Central Europe, consisting at the minimum of Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, with each of these countries being free of foreign troops and influence and prohibited from forming alliances with countries outside the zone. In the Middle East, Russell suggested that the West avoid opposing Arab nationalism and proposed the creation of a United Nations peacekeeping force to guard Israel's frontiers, to ensure that Israel was prevented from committing aggression and protected from it. He also suggested Western recognition of the People's Republic of China, and that it be admitted to the UN with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. He was in contact with Lionel Rogozin while the latter was filming his anti-war film Good Times, Wonderful Times in the 1960s. He became a hero to many of the youthful members of the New Left. In early 1963, Russell became increasingly vocal in his disapproval of the Vietnam War and felt that the US policies there were near genocidal. In 1963, he became the inaugural recipient of the Jerusalem Prize, an award for writers concerned with the freedom of the individual in society. In 1964, he was one of 11 world figures who issued an appeal to Israel and the Arab countries to accept an arms embargo and international supervision of nuclear plants and rocket weaponry. In October 1965, he tore up his Labour Party card because he suspected Harold Wilson's Labour government was going to send troops to support the United States in Vietnam. In June 1955, Russell had leased Plas Penrhyn in Penrhyn Dewdraith, Merionethshire, Wales, and on the 5th of July of the following year, it became his and Edith's principal residence. Russell published his 3-volume autobiography in 1967, 1968, and 1969. He made a cameo appearance playing himself in the anti-war Hindi film Aman by Mohan Kumar, which was released in India in 1967. This was Russell's only appearance in a feature film. On the 23rd of November 1969, he wrote to the Times newspaper saying that the preparation for show trials in Czechoslovakia was highly alarming. The same month, he appealed to Secretary General U Thant of the United Nations to support an International War Crimes Commission to investigate alleged torture and genocide by the United States in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The following month, he protested to Alexei Kosygin over the expulsion of Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Soviet Union of Writers. On the 31st of January 1970, Russell issued a statement condemning Israel's aggression in the Middle East, and in particular Israeli bombing raids being carried out deep in Egyptian territory as part of the War of Attrition, which he compared to German bombing raids in the Battle of Britain and the US bombing of Vietnam. He called for an Israeli withdrawal to the pre-Six-Day War borders, stating, "The aggression committed by Israel must be condemned, not only because no state has the right to annex foreign territory, but because every expansion is an experiment to discover how much more aggression the world will tolerate. This was Russell's final political statement or act. It was read out at the International Conference of Parliamentarians in Cairo on the 3rd of February 1970, the day after his death. Russell died of influenza just after 8 p.m. on the 2nd of February 1970 at his home in Penrhynderdraith, aged 97. His body was cremated in Colwyn Bay on the 5th of February 1970 with 5 people present. In accordance with his will, there was no religious ceremony but 1 minute's silence. His ashes were later scattered over the Welsh mountains. Although he was born in Monmouthshire and died in Penrhynderdraith in Wales, Russell identified as English. Later in 1970, on the 23rd of October, his will was published, showing he had left an estate valued at £69,423, equivalent to £1.4 million in 2023. In 1980, a memorial to Russell was commissioned by a committee including the philosopher A.J. Ayer. It consists of a bust of Russell in Red Lion Square in London, sculpted by Marcel Quinton. Lady Catherine Jane Tate, Russell's daughter, founded the Bertrand Russell Society in 1974 to preserve and understand his work. It publishes the Bertrand Russell Society Bulletin, holds meetings and awards prizes for scholarship, including the Bertrand Russell Society Award. She also authored several essays about her father, as well as a book, My Father, Bertrand Russell, which was published in 1975. In 1889, Russell, at 17 years of age, met the family of Alice Pearsall Smith, an American Quaker 5 years older who was a graduate of Bryn Mawr College near Philadelphia. He became a friend of the Pearsall Smith family. They knew him as Lord John's grandson and enjoyed showing him off. He fell in love with Alice and, contrary to his grandmother's wishes, married her on the 13th of December 1894. Their marriage began to fall apart in 1901 when it occurred to Russell while cycling that he no longer loved her Dot. She asked him if he loved her, and he cruelly replied that he did not. Russell also disliked Alice's mother, finding her controlling and cruel. A lengthy period of separation began in 1911 with Russell's affair with Lady Ottoline Morell, 145, and he and Alice finally divorced in 1921 to enable Russell to remarry. During his years of separation from Alice, Russell had affairs with a number of women, including Morell and the actress Lady Constance Malson. Some have suggested that at this point he had an affair with Vivian Haywood, the English governess and writer and first wife of T.S. Eliot. In 1921, his second marriage was to Dora Winifred Black, MBE, died 1986, daughter of Sir Frederick Black. Dora was 6 months pregnant when the couple returned to England. This was dissolved in 1935, having produced 2 children, John Conrad Russell, 4th Earl Russell, 1921 and 1987, and Lady Catherine Jane Russell, 1923-2021. Russell's third marriage was to Patricia Helen Spence, died 2004 in 1936, with the marriage producing 1 child, Conrad Sebastian Robert Russell, 5th Earl Russell, 1937-2004. 5th Earl Russell, who became a historian and one of the leading figures in the Liberal Democrat Party. Russell's third marriage ended in divorce in 1952. He married Edith Finch in the same year. Finch died in 1978. Upon his brother's death in 1931, Russell became the 3rd Earl Russell of Kingston Russell and the subsidiary title of Viscount Amberley of Amberley and of Ardsala. He held both titles and the accompanying seat in the House of Lords until his death in 1970. Russell was the author of more than 60 books and over 2,000 articles. Additionally, he wrote many pamphlets, introductions, and letters to the editor. One pamphlet titled I Appeal unto Caesar, The Case of the Conscientious Objectors, ghostwritten for Margaret Hobhouse, the mother of imprisoned peace activist Stephen Hobhouse, allegedly helped secure the release from prison of hundreds of conscientious objectors. His works can be found in anthologies and collections, including the collected papers of Bertrand Russell, which McMaster University began publishing in 1983. By March 2017, this collection of his shorter and previously unpublished works included 18 volumes, and several more are in progress. A bibliography in 3 additional volumes catalogues his publications. The Russell Archives, held by McMaster's William Reddy Division of Archives and Research Collections, possess over 40,000 of his letters. We have come to the end of my Bertrand Russell study. In this study, I examined some encyclopedic content, famous quotes and mathematics books, especially internet sources. Thank you for being with me. If you are not a subscriber, do not forget to subscribe and like the video.